Thank you, Doug. It's a pleasure to be here, and I want to thank everyone who came. I think you'll enjoy this presentation. Oh, there, now I'm on. Yeah. Anyways, thank everyone who came, and I think you'll enjoy what we're going to talk about. We can get a little more in depth with questions afterwards. There's a lot to cover, and I want to try to make sure that we talk about all the different aspects. But what this presentation is about, the first part is about the places you can go see in Michigan that currently exist. And then we're going to get into some of the incredible, fascinating stories about people from Michigan that were involved in the Civil War. And this museum's a great place for that, talks about some of that stuff. And there's a lot of connections between Michigan and Wisconsin also. Of course, when you're talking about, number one, the Iron Brigade. But anyways, these are the categories that we're going to talk about in Michigan Civil War sites and stories. President Abraham Lincoln said, "Thank God for Michigan," when the 1st Michigan Infantry arrived in Washington, D.C. in early summer of 1861. They were the first Western regiment to show up into Washington, so Lincoln was overjoyed by that. 90,000 Michiganians answered Lincoln's call. Nearly 15,000 made the ultimate sacrifice. At Gettysburg, the 24th Michigan Infantry sustained 80% casualties. That was the largest amount of any regiment in the Battle of Gettysburg. Of course, they were in the Iron Brigade. At Appomattox Courthouse, the first surrender flag of the Army of Northern Virginia was received by Michigan's Major General George Armstrong Custer. Michigan contributed 31 infantry regiments, 11 cavalry regiments, 14 batteries of light artillery, 1 engineer and mechanics, 1 sharpshooters, and several companies in other state and U.S. regular Army regiments. These are some of the more well-known generals, and some of them you might be surprised, that had a connection to Michigan. Alger, Berdan, Custer, Farnsworth, Hunt, Minty, Morrow, Pierce, Poe, Pritchard, Richardson, Schaffner, Wilcox, and the 2 Williams. And we're going to talk about all of them. Now on the travel tour, I do a top 10 list. And my number 1 monument that I think is the best in Michigan is the Soldiers and Sailors in Muskegon. So we're in Wisconsin, you can take the ferry over, right? And go to Muskegon, that's the easiest way. But this is the monument, it's in Hackley Park. Charles Hackley was a lumber baron who built all these with his own funds. And if you ever go to Muskegon, you'll notice a lot of different buildings. He is the one that put them up. But this is a fabulous monument in that park. Next. But what sets it off in my estimation is, number 1 is on the 4 corners of the park are individual statues of Sherman, Grant, Lincoln, and Farragut. Also across the street is a monument to William McKinley. Number 2. Number 2 is the more well-known one in Michigan, and that is the Soldiers and Sailors, which represents the whole state in downtown Detroit. That is located in Campus Martius, which is a very popular spot today where a lot is happening. That was attended by Generals Custer, Sheridan, Burnside, and Wood. So it was important when it was dedicated. Next. Number 3 is in defense of the flag, and this is in Jackson. And this sculpture represents the 17th Michigan at South Mountain, where they got the nickname the Stonewall Regiment. Number 4 is Lansing. If you've ever been to the state capitol, you know that we have monuments all around the capitol. Most of them are Civil War. The first one there on the left is the 1st Michigan Sharpshooters. They were very unique because of Company K. Company K was made up of Michigan Native Americans. They were Ottawa, Ojibwa, and Potawatomi. In the middle is 1st Engineers and Mechanics. They were a backbone of Sherman's army during the Atlanta campaign and Sherman's march to the sea. In the middle there is a replica cannon, which we're going to talk about the battery later on. That's a replica of a Loomis battery gun, which was Company A. In front of the state capitol, there used to be 2 original Loomis cannons, but in the 1940s, you could probably guess what happened to them. During World War II, they were melted down. And recently, they have made replicas, and they put them on the original spots. And believe it or not, the original cement spots for the Capitol were still there. And then this is our Civil War Governor, Austin Blair, who stands in front of the Capitol. Number 5 is Dowagiac. That is near the Indiana line, and is the Cass County Soldiers and Sailors Monument. It is all granite. There's no bronze. And you can see in the upper right-hand corner, you'll see this a lot with Civil War monuments. They all kind of went up at the same time, turn of the century period, and they look like a turn of the century person, right? They have a handlebar mustache. A lot of them have that. Next. Number 6 is unique, and it's more recent. This is Hillsdale College. And recently, Hillsdale, all around their campus, have life-size statues of certain people in American history, also British. And for the Civil War, they have Lincoln and Frederick Douglass. Frederick Douglass actually visited Hillsdale twice, and his famous, his portrait of himself that he liked the most, that he put on his calling card, was actually taken at Hillsdale. And in the middle is a statue to the students that went off to the war. Matter of fact, Hillsdale sent the highest percentage of students from a private college in the Midwest at around 400. Now, the largest college in Michigan that sent students off to war was the University of Michigan. They sent 1,514. Now, this would also include graduates afterwards. Next. Next, we have Grand Rapids, and that is the Kent County Civil War Monument. And what makes that unique is it is made of white bronze or zinc. It's a different type of material that was used. You'll see this in cemeteries sometimes. And that, a few years ago, was refurbished. It has a fountain around it. And then you can see where it has pictures, portraits of the heroes of the Union around it. Normally, that would be Grant, Sherman, Farragut, and Lincoln. Also in Grand Rapids is at the Soldiers' Home. And this is a monument that I like a lot because it looks like a real Civil War soldier with an actual beard. But this is in the actual soldiers' home in Grand Rapids, which was started during the Civil War, still exists today. It's right off of I-96. Now, the last 2 I'm going to add are equestrian monuments. One of the most beautiful equestrian monuments supposedly in the country is the Custer one. And this is the monument of Custer in Monroe. This is the uniform he's wearing on the actual monument. You can see the braiding on the velveteen uniform. This is supposedly the uniform that he wore at Gettysburg. The braiding is on the arms there, but there's been a new theory that he didn't wear that. We'll talk about that later on. But Libby Custer approved this, so I don't know if that's accurate or not. But anyways, when this monument was dedicated, 25,000 people attended, including President William Howard Taft. And this depicts Custer at the Battle of Gettysburg. Next. The other equestrian monument is of General Alpheus Starkey Williams. And Williams was known as Michigan's citizen general because he was a non-West Pointer. Some think he was the best general that Michigan produced. And that is at Belle Isle, if you know where that is, which is in the Detroit River, which is now a state park. Now we're going to go to the top 5 cemeteries. No one can hold a candle to this one in Michigan, and this is Elmwood in Detroit. This is the one that is just full of Civil War history. There are 600 Union veterans in Elmwood, 28 generals, 3 Medal of Honor recipients, and 17 102nd U.S. Colored Infantry soldiers. Michigan had 1 colored regiment, and that was the 102nd. It was the first Michigan, then was made the 102nd U.S. Now also in there is a Native American, John Jaco. I won't try to pronounce his native name, but he is buried there. You can see he's in Company K, 1st Michigan. That should be sharpshooters. Also in there is many anti-slavery participants. Next. Alpheus Williams is also there. Williams ended up being a brigadier general and then a major general, and he was a brigade commander all the way to a corps commander. He fought in the battles of Antietam, Chancellorsville, Gettysburg, and the Atlanta campaign. He is famous for his memoir, From the Cannon's Mouth. This is a Medal of Honor awardee that was in the 13th Michigan Infantry that got that during the Atlanta campaign. This guy right here is Thomas Williams. We were talking earlier about Fort Mackinac. He actually was at Fort Mackinac before the war. When you go into Fort Mackinac on Mackinac Island, when you go up that long stairway to go into the front, you'll see a plaque right there on the door, and it's to him, Thomas Williams. Williams' father was the first mayor of Detroit. And if you drive around Detroit, there is a road called the John R. That is his father. He will end up being killed in the Battle of Baton Rouge on August 5th, 1862, and he is mentioned numerous times in a very famous diary by Sarah Morgan called The Civil War Diary of a Southern Woman. These are some other guys that are in Elmwood. This is Frederick Swift. He's a Medal of Honor awardee. He ended up being commander of the 17th Michigan Infantry, known as the Stonewall Regiment. This is Colonel Thornton Broadhead, who we dedicate the book to. He has a very poignant letter in the front of the book that when he is actually mortally wounded, he's writing a letter that'll make you cry to his family while he's dying. But he will be mortally wounded at the Battle of Second Bull Run. He was in the 1st Michigan Cavalry, the commander. And then this is a very interesting guy here. Anybody got any idea who this guy is? Philip St. George Cook. He is the father-in-law of James Ewell Brown Stuart, the famous Confederate general. He was a Virginian that stayed loyal to the Union. Of course, after the war, he doesn't dare go back to Virginia, right? So he settles in Detroit, ends up dying there, and is buried in Elmwood. He's well known for his Cavalry Tactics book. Next. These are the Civil War politicians in Elmwood. The first one is Lewis Cass. Lewis Cass ran for president against Zachary Taylor and narrowly was defeated. He's one of the original people that was very involved in the establishment of Michigan as a territory and a state. He was a soldier in the War of 1812. But he will be on the staff of James Buchanan. He's his Secretary of State when Fort Sumter is fired on, and he disagrees with how Buchanan handled things and resigned. So the rest of the war, he would give political speeches in Detroit where he lived. Abraham Lincoln, actually in a letter where he criticized him because he was a Democrat, he used the phrase, the Great Michigander. Though I guess that phrase actually was used before, but Lincoln's kind of credited with calling him a Michigander. So, you know, when you live in Michigan, you call yourself a Michiganian or a Michigander. In the middle, that mausoleum is Russell Alger. Alger will fight with Custer in the Michigan Cavalry Brigade, will become a major general, go into politics, be a congressman, a senator. He will end up being the Secretary of War during the Spanish-American War. On the top right and the bottom are the 2 senators from Michigan during the Civil War. This one on the bottom, Zachariah Chandler, was a big-time abolitionist. He thought Lincoln was weak when it came to slavery. And on the top is someone who's been forgotten, Jacob Howard. And it's kind of a shame because Jacob Howard, you probably can't see it, But that's a quote from the 13th Amendment. Jacob Howard was one of the main authors of the 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery. He also was on the committee for the 14th Amendment. So he's very important to the country's history, but he's someone you don't hear a lot about. But he was the main author on the 13th Amendment. Next. This is Jackson, and this is Mount Evergreen, and the Civil War governor of Michigan is there, Austin Blair. This is a monument called the Laura Evans Monument that was put up by a family in the Veterans Plot. And we have a Medal of Honor person there from Vermont. There's also another in a naval regiment. And then this is William Withington. Withington will be awarded the Medal of Honor at Bull Run, will end up being the commander of the Stonewall Regiment, the 17th. And all these cemeteries have numerous Civil War people, and we'll cover a few. This is Woodland in Monroe, which I am heavily involved in. I do the tours for it. And this first guy on the left is a fascinating guy. He is George Spalding. Spalding will be in the 4th Michigan. In the Battle of Malvern Hill, he'll be shot in the belt buckle, and in another area, he's reported dead, but he miraculously survives. He'll end up being the lieutenant colonel of the 18th Michigan. Then he'll be the colonel of the 12th Tennessee Cavalry, U.S. And the guy that helped get him that position was none other than Andrew Johnson, because at the time, Andrew Johnson is military governor of Tennessee. But what he's getting a lot of play for recently is what he did at Nashville. He was the provost marshal, and they had a huge VD problem in Nashville. And he was charged with cleaning it up. So he puts them on paddle boats to Cincinnati and Louisville, and they don't want them, they send them back. So he ends up legalizing it. And they have to be certified by a doctor. And I actually found on the internet one of those certifications that he actually signed. But he did a pretty good job of cleaning it up. These two guys are an example of brothers who died during the war. Franklin died at the Battle of Malvern Hill. Henry died at the Battle of Yellow Tavern, which we're going to talk about later. And then what Woodland is known for is the Custer Plot. This is where the Custer family are buried. And George is not there, and Tom is not there. George is actually in 2 spots. That's a trivia question. And if he's at the 2nd spot. But most of George is probably out at the battlefield, and part of him is at West Point. I think he's probably there, but there's questions about that. But his nephew, Audie Reed, who was 18 and was a senior at Monroe High School, who was on summer vacation just out for a good time, of course died with his famous uncle. He's buried there, and so is Boston, his brother. This is Boston right here, and Audie's in the back. Next. This is Woodmere in Detroit. That's the monument to the 19th who were stationed, 19th U.S., who were stationed at Fort Wayne. This is where you can see here in 1896, 156 soldiers and their families were reburied there from Fort Wayne, which we're going to talk about. This is Vreeland. There's a Vreeland Avenue in Downriver area. He was severely wounded at Gettysburg, and I don't know if you could see this right here, but do you know who this guy is? If you can read that, you'll know. But this guy is famous for the country's first soft drink. Do you know what that is? Verners. This is James Verners, who, before he goes off to the war in the 4th Michigan Cavalry, he puts this concoction together in an oak barrel. He comes back 4 years later from the war. He tastes this, it's fantastic. He markets it, and it becomes Verners Ginger Ale. Yep. Next. By the way, in that same cemetery we'll talk a little auto history, is Henry Leland. And Henry Leland is the founder of Cadillac and Lincoln Motor Company. So how is Leland connected to the Civil War? During the Civil War, he was fairly young, but he was working in the Springfield Armory making Springfield rifled muskets. Henry Ford was born during the Civil War, but his 2 uncles maternal uncles were in the 24th of the Iron Brigade, Michigan Infantry. Next. Grand Rapids. Stephen Chaplin was severely wounded at the Battle of Second Bull Run. He was brought back to Grand Rapids and died and is buried there. On your right is William Innes. He was the commander of the Michigan Engineers and Mechanics, as we mentioned, that were one of the chief mechanical organizations that, tore up railroads and then built different things for the Union Army under Sherman. And then this guy is one of my favorites. This is the fighting dentist. He was a dentist in Grand Rapids, General Byron Root Pierce. In all the major battles of the Army of the Potomac, he was severely shot up at Gettysburg, but did survive. Next. Now we're going to go to the top 5 destinations to visit. Number 1 by far is Fort Wayne. And a lot of people have never heard of Fort Wayne, but if you're from Detroit area, you know what it is. Okay? Fort Wayne is a fabulous place, and it's going to be redeveloped because the new Gordie Howe Bridge is going right next to it to Sandwich, Ontario. And when you come off that bridge, probably from the Canadian side going to the American side, you will look right down into that fort. So there are different things being talked about. They are looking for different businesses to develop some of the outbuildings. There's a rumor the National Park may take over the fort part. But that is a bricked fort like Fort Sumter, the only one in the Midwest. Also, it is a history of the military in Detroit because it was founded in the 1840s all the way through Vietnam. And those buildings represent all those different eras. There's actually a cavalry stable like you see out west. So we'll see what happens, but a lot of the buildings are in ruins. Some will probably be bulldozed down, some will probably be developed. But I'm looking forward to see what they do with it. But the brick part is in very good shape. And it was built between 1842 and 1849, and it was the first major structure designed by an Army engineer known as Lieutenant Montgomery C. Meigs. And you all know what he was famous for. Remember, Robert E. Lee was his classmate, and he was upset with Lee for going with the Confederacy, and also because his son may or may not have been wounded in the Shenandoah, and he was livid. And he said, I'm going to bury our Union soldiers in Mrs. Lee's rose garden so he can never live there again, which is what happened. That's the same guy who designed and built Fort Wayne.
What's his name again? Meigs.
Montgomery Meigs, yes. He built a bunch of Washington, D.C. Matter of fact, there's buildings in Washington, D.C. that he built and designed.
Can you spell it?
Next, I think he was involved in completing the Capitol, too.
Is Fort Wayne open right now?
Can you spell it?
On the weekends.
On the weekends, okay. Thank you.
How do you spell that man's name again?
It's M-E-I-G-S.
Oh,
Now, on Fort Wayne this is the Soldier Barracks. It's a beautiful barracks made of Lake Erie limestone. It was quarried at Kelly's Island. And it is 3 floors, and that was the barracks for the infantrymen. This is the powder magazine, and then these are the casemates, though they never had a gun mounted. They built it at the narrowest point between Canada and the U.S. because there was a fear after the War of 1812 that the British would come back over and seize Detroit, because that is where Isaac Brock and Tecumseh came across and seized Detroit. A lot happened in that area. Next. This is the GAR building in Detroit. And this has just been refurbished. This was in very bad shape. And a company bought it. And fortunately, my son and I just went through it last summer. We were lucky enough, the owner. And you'll never guess how we got in it. We went to a Verners Club meeting. Because Verners was a member. And so luckily I knew a guy who knew a guy. But we got inside it. They've recreated. These were actual paintings. They're gone now, but they recreated, did a very good job. But it's called the Castle, and you can see why. It's a very unique building. And this is on the top. When you're at the top of the castle there, you can look out over Detroit. Next.
Dave? It's on Grand River and what? Because I tried to find it and I couldn't find it.
Yeah, I got it in the book, but it is, you're right. It's right near Comerica Park.
Right, okay.
Matter of fact, the reason that The reason why it ended up, someone fortunately stepped up to the plate, because it cost millions of dollars to redo this thing, was that it was going to be part of Comerica Park. And so, yeah, it was. Comerica Park was going to be a little over. That's the baseball stadium, by the way. Okay, number 3 is the Monroe County Historical Museum. That's the top museum with Custer memorabilia in the country. This is the Civil War display, which was also incredible. This is Norman Hall, which we're going to talk about. This is an interesting piece here. This is the actual document which got Norman Hall approved to West Point, and you'll never guess who signed it. You have any idea before the war who was the Secretary of War? Yeah, Jefferson Davis.
Oh, okay.
This is a very important flag in Michigan history. I'm going to show you probably the most important one, but this probably is the second. This is the flag that was Custer's headquarter flag when he commanded the Michigan Cavalry Brigade, not the 3rd Division, the one that everyone normally sees, the red and the blue with a cross saber. It's this one. This actually was blue, but it has the battle honors. You can see on there Gettysburg. This is when he commanded the Michigan Cavalry Brigade. So for Michigan history, this is very important. That's the most famous cavalry regiments in the Union Army. That's the actual flag. It was donated to the museum by the Custer family. Next. This is in Lansing, and this is the State Museum. This is the Michigan Cavalry Brigade flag. The other one was his personal headquarter flag. That's the brigade flag. And the Michigan Cavalry Brigade were made up of the 1st, 5th, 6th, and 7th Michigan regiments. They were all brigaded under one state, highly unusual. They would become the most well-known, famous, and also lose the most men of a cavalry brigade. This is an interesting gun. This guy was in the 66th Illinois. He was from Michigan, and he has engraved on there, that's a Henry, he has engraved all the battles he was in. That's in the State Museum. Next. You see how precise it is? These are some of the flags that are in our archives at the Michigan State Museum that are preserved. You know, all these states are doing this now. That's Michigan Cavalry Brigade, the 6th. That's the 1st in the Michigan Cavalry Brigade. This one right here is probably the most important flag in Michigan history. And there are bloodstains down here where it's dark. That is the flag of the 24th Michigan of the Iron Brigade that was shot to pieces at Herbst Woods at the Battle of Gettysburg. 14 flag bearers went down holding that flag, and some of their blood is actually on it. So there's not a whole lot left of it because it was shot up. Next. Finally, just for the beauty, I'm recommending the Kewanov Peninsula of the Upper Peninsula. But the reason I have it on here is, number one, you've got Fort Wilkes. This is a pre-Civil War fort that was built because of copper. The Upper Peninsula of Michigan was the lead for the Union Army in getting copper, for the things they needed copper for, also iron. It was very important. It was so important that Lincoln, in 1864, built a military road from Fort Wilkes to Green Bay to get it out. Next. Now we're going to get into the interesting stories. We're going to start with Underground Railroad. This person you may have not heard of, but in Michigan, she is very well known. And this is Laura Haviland. Laura founded the Raisin Institute, which was one of the first integrated schools in the United States, not just for African Americans, but for women. She was a huge abolitionist and conductor on the Underground Railroad. She would come down to the Ohio line and take numerous escaped slaves up to Detroit and then over to Canada. She was so despised by certain people in the South that owned slaves. They would send bounty hunters to get her. And they had a $3,000 bounty on her for her kidnapping or death. She's from Adrian. This is in Adrian where the statue is, her grave is just north of Adrian. She would go around talking about the evils of slavery and use props. And that's her dress, which is at the State Museum. Next is Sojourner Truth. Okay, did you know Sojourner Truth was from Michigan?
No.
She lived in Battle Creek. Now, originally, she was from New York. Her actual name was Isabella Baumfree. She actually escaped from enslavement in 1826. And from what state? You got any idea?
New York?
That's right, from New York. You wouldn't think that, would you? But you still had slavery at that time period in the North. She toured the country speaking out against slavery and advocating African American and women's rights. She also recruited black troops for the Union Army. She recruited for the 102nd U.S. Colored, who were from Michigan. She also recruited for the 54th Massachusetts. Matter of fact, her grandson, James Caldwell, served in Company H of the 54th Massachusetts. A lot of people don't know that the 54th just wasn't from New England. They recruited African Americans from all over the North, and they went through Ohio, Michigan, recruiting. So her grandson was part of that. That's her grave in Battle Creek. You'll never guess who she's buried right in back of. There's a huge mausoleum in front of her grave. Got any idea what's Battle Creek famous for?
Kellogg.
Kellogg. She's right in back of Kellogg's mausoleum. Next. Now, there are a couple of raids that are somewhat well known. The one is the Vandalia. The other is the Adam Cross raid in Marshall. Vandalia is a small town in the central part of the state, central south part of the state in Cass County. And what happened, you can see from the marker here, it was Quakers, settled by Quakers, and they were harboring escaped slaves. And you had slave catchers coming up from Kentucky that were seeking them out. And here's an instance where actual Quakers had guns, and they actually had a meeting between them where they're pointing the guns at each other. The actual Quakers had guns too. And what happened was, before they came, they got the escaped slaves into Canada. There ended up being a court case, which they actually lost. They had to pay for them, but they did get them out of there and they escaped. Now this incident, along with this incident in Marshall, the Adam Crosswright case, were some of the cases that led to the 1850 Fugitive Slave Act, where it was illegal to harbor escaped slaves, even in Michigan, even in Wisconsin. That was against the federal government to do that. This guy supposedly helped thousands of escaped slaves. His name is Erastus Hussey, and he was from Battle Creek. And this is supposed to be the largest monument to the Underground Railroad in the country. And what happened with him is he was elected to the state senate, not U.S., but state, and he enacted a law for the state of Michigan. It was called the Michigan Personal Freedom Act of 1855, which blocked the Fugitive Slave Act. But that was only in Michigan. This is George D. Baptiste, and this is at Hart Plaza, downtown Detroit on the Detroit River. There's another one on the Windsor side. And D. Baptiste was a African-American businessman, very successful, and he had boats. He would harbor them across the Detroit River into Canada. And he's very well known in Detroit as an Underground Railroad conductor, buried in Elmwood. His son was in the 54th Massachusetts. Interesting thing though, before the war, he was the actual personal valet of President William Henry Harrison. And he was at Harrison's bedside when he died. When Harrison dies, he comes to Detroit. Next. This is Captain Jonathan Walker. Walker's known as the man with the branded hand. He is buried in Muskegon. Walker's a fascinating case before the war. Remember what we talked about? It was against the United States government to harbor escaped slaves. Well, he's in Pensacola, Florida. He's a captain with a boat. He tries to help escaped slaves, I think there were 7 or 10, from Pensacola. He tries to take them to freedom. He had to go around the Florida Peninsula, and outside between the Bahamas and Florida, he gets captured. The United States government, this is before there's any Confederate government, try him, find him guilty. He is imprisoned. He is fined. He is put in one of those stockades and pelted with eggs. But the worst thing was the United States government took a hot branding iron and branded his hand SS for slave stealer. He will become a person that will go around before the war, during the war, about the evils of slavery. And he will move to Michigan, become a fruit farmer. Next. Frederick Douglass and John Brown met at this building. This is the Webb House. And if you're familiar with Detroit, this is in Greektown. And they'll happen to meet at this house with abolitionists from Detroit. And the meeting was about John Brown's ideas about seizing Harper's Ferry. And if you know the story, Douglass was against it, but he still supported Brown. So what Brown was doing was he was trying to collect money for his raid on Harper's Ferry. He will leave Detroit and go over to Canada. But months later will be Harper's Ferry, and we all know what happened. Next. Now, a lot of people don't know that Grant and Meade lived in Detroit. That's right. And Grant lived in Detroit right after the Mexican War from 1849 to 1851. He was stationed at the Detroit Barracks, and this was his house. Still exists today. It's just been moved to the Eastern Market. It's going to be refurbished. This is Meade. Meade lived in Detroit from 1857 to 1861, and the reason was he was the chief engineer of the Great Lakes Survey. He was surveying the Great Lakes. And the war breaks out, he's still in Michigan. He almost became a commander of a Michigan regiment. Next. These are some more well-known generals. This is Wilcox. Wilcox was actually from Detroit, a West Point grad. He will get the Medal of Honor also at Bull Run. He will become the colonel of the 1st Michigan Infantry. So he was the most well-known Michigan soldier when the Civil War breaks out. He will go from brigade to corps commander. He will fight at Antietam, Fredericksburg, Knoxville, the Overland Campaign, and Petersburg. This next guy is the Custer of the West. This is Robert Horatio Gates Minty. Minty was born in Ireland, served in the British Army. He will immigrate to Canada. He worked for the railroads, which will bring him to Detroit. The war breaks out, and he will become the commander of the 4th Michigan Cavalry. Then he will become a brigade commander that will be known as Minty's Sabres. They were extremely important at the Battle of Chickamauga, Day 1. They held up Reed Bridge, and basically as a 7-1 or 10-1 odds against the Confederates on Reed Bridge. He's compared a lot to John Buford in the first day of Gettysburg and what he did. Next guy is Elon Farnsworth. If you know the story about the young captains that were made generals before the Battle of Gettysburg, it was Wesley Merritt, George Custer, and Elon Farnsworth. Custer and Farnsworth were from Michigan. Farnsworth, though, won't be general for only about a week, as he's killed at South Cavalry Field when Kill Cavalry sends him against an impregnable position, and he ends up mortally wounded and dies. He was a student at University of Michigan and got kicked out. They had like a frat party. A guy fell out a window and died, and they kicked him out. But he had a very famous or well-known uncle who was a congressman. Next. This is Henry Hunt, who was chief of artillery of the Army of the Potomac. Henry Hunt was born in Detroit. His uncle was the 2nd mayor of Detroit. Hunts are very big in southeast Michigan, northwest Ohio, early history. Hunt will become very well known at the Battle of Gettysburg because all the artillery for the Union Army against Pickett's charge were in command of Henry Hunt. And if you know the story, you saw the movie Gettysburg, how the Union Army, remember, he's telling them, hold your fire, while the Confederates are, firing the cannon, that cannon barrage for an hour or so, and he held, and then Pickett's charge happens, and then he lets loose on him. This is Orlando Poe. He was Sherman's engineer during the Atlanta campaign and Sherman's march. He was a brilliant engineer. He commanded the 2nd Michigan Infantry for a while, but after the war, he'll be involved on the Great Lakes. He designed all kinds of lighthouses on the Great Lakes. But this is what he's known for. You got any idea what he's known for? You ever heard of the Poe Lock? The Poe Lock at the Sioux Locks. That's him. He's the one that designed it. This is Hiram Berdan. You probably didn't think he was connected to Michigan. He's usually connected to New York. He was from New York, but grew up during his childhood, almost all his childhood, on a farm in Plymouth, Michigan. And he is the commander of Berdan's famous sharpshooters, the guys that wore the green uniforms. This is Major General Israel Richardson. Richardson may have been Michigan's most famous general if he hadn't been mortally wounded at Antietam. But he commanded the 1st Division of the 2nd Corps, and they attacked the sunken road at Antietam. That included the Irish Brigade. They were under his command. But he will get hit by a piece of shrapnel. He'll end up being taken to the Pry House, which was McClellan's headquarters. They think he may survive, but he develops pneumonia and dies. A recent book that was written about him, supposedly a soldier overheard Lincoln. Lincoln actually visited him while he was hopefully recovering. And supposedly this soldier heard Lincoln tell him, "When you recover, General, I'm going to put you in command of the whole Union Army." So that would have been the Army of the Potomac. If you know what happened, McClellan was sacked, and who got put in his place? Burnside. Well, if he'd survived, it probably would have been him if that's true. Next. This is Pecos Bill. This is William Schaffner. Schaffner was in the 7th Michigan, where he awarded the Medal of Honor. He'll be major of the 19th. Then he'll be commander of the actual 17th U.S. Colored, who fought at Nashville. But what he's known for is he was the major general in charge of the 5th Corps during the Spanish-American War. And the Rough Riders were under his command. But he had a hard time. As you can see, he weighed 300 pounds. See him right here on the horse? He was 63 and weighed 300 pounds, and he was sick most of the time. But he was the main guy for the land troops in Cuba during the Spanish-American War. Next, he was from Galesburg. This is Norman Hall. Norman Hall and the Forlorn Hope at Fredericksburg. Norman Hall was from Monroe. Custer and Norman knew each other. They both were at West Point 2 years. Hall was 2 years ahead of him. Hall was appointed to West Point from Michigan, where Custer was from Ohio. Was appointed from Ohio. He was connected to both states. Hall will be at Fort Sumter when it's fired on, the only man from Michigan that was there. At Antietam, he will take brigade command when Dana, the brigade commander, will be wounded in the West Woods, and he will have brigade command. At Fredericksburg, he will volunteer the 7th Michigan, along with the 19th Mass, to go across the Rappahannock River in Fredericksburg. The town of Fredericksburg was occupied by Mississippi troops, and the New York engineers refused to go any farther in building their pontoon bridge because they were getting picked off. So they needed volunteers to go across the river. So it was an amphibious assault. And they used the little boats here that propped up the bridge. So he volunteered his men to go across. They thought it was a suicide mission. It actually didn't end up being that bad. But they will get the name the Forlorn Hope at Fredericksburg. This is their flag in Monroe at the museum where the Custer memorabilia is. And it says Forlorn Hope at Fredericksburg. Next. Also, they will be very prominent at the Battle of Gettysburg. This is the blow-up of the cyclorama at Gettysburg. This is right in the middle. That's the copse of trees. And over here is Armistead breaking through. That critical period when Armistead and the Confederates have broken through at the angle where if they get through, the Union Army might lose and the country might be divided today, right? Norman Hall from Monroe, Michigan is the last brigade to send his men in to plug that hole. And what's going on here? The guy in the white horse is Alexander Webb, who has a statue there and gets a Medal of Honor. He has just went to Hall and says, my line has been bridged. Someone has gotten through my line, and I need help. So Hall sends in right here the 19th Massachusetts, and they go in and plug the hole, and the Union Army ends up defeating the Confederates, at least at Pickett's charge. Interesting, another regiment in his command was the 20th Massachusetts. They're very well known. They're the Harvard Regiment. And who was in that regiment? Got any idea?
Paul Revere's grandson.
That's right. Can you repeat that?
Paul Revere's grandson.
Paul Revere's grandson. Also, I forgot, but the Supreme Court Justice, Oliver Wendell Holmes, was part of that. Hall was their commander. Okay, next. This is Henry Morrow and the 24th Michigan. They were part, of course, of the Iron Brigade that had the 3 Wisconsin regiments with the 19th Indiana. Morrow was actually a Virginian, but he comes to Detroit, becomes a lawyer, ends up being their commander. He's an interesting character, stayed in the Army, but he will lead the 24th. This is their monument at Gettysburg. This is the Michigan Cavalry Brigade monument at Gettysburg. And next to the 24th Michigan, probably the most famous regiments from Michigan will be the cavalry regiments. They were the most well-known, battle-hardened cavalry regiments in the Union Army. And at Gettysburg is where Custer and the Michigan cavalrymen will end up helping save the day. It's debate about how much they helped. But definitely if they had lost this battle, it wouldn't have helped the Union Army. Because what happened was the Confederates out of Jeb Stuart were trying to get around the Union line while Pickett's charge, and it might have been coordinated, not coordinated, but he was trying to create havoc in the back of the Union line. So if they ended up retreating, they could end up capturing them all, fighting them, creating havoc, because that was the road that led to where the Union would have had to go if they were retreating. So it's a very important, it's the backside of the Union line during Pickett's charge where Norman Hall was on the front line. Well, the Michigan Cavalry Brigade, made up of those regiments we talked about, will take on Jeb Stuart for the first time, will beat his Invincibles, and they will lose that battle. So this is where they will become important. This is, of course, the famous quote that Custer said, "Come on, you Wolverines," to the 1st Michigan. And this is what Custer may have looked like during that battle, and he may have been wearing this uniform. This is actually blue velveteen, if it wasn't the one with the stripes of it. And that horse, this is the horse the statue was modeled after. Okay, next. These are the 4th Michigan Infantry Colonels, Dwight Woodbury, Harrison Jeffords, and George Lombard. They will all be killed in battle, which is unusual to lose that many colonels. This was a fighting regiment that lost more men in battle than they did by disease, which was unusual. Woodbury will be shot between the eyes at Melbourne Hill. Jeffords will be the highest ranking Union officer to die by bayonet in the wheat field in Gettysburg. And Lombard will die in the wilderness. That's Woodbury's grave in Adrian, Jeffords' grave in Dexter. We don't have the grave of Lombard. He was buried at the wilderness, but when they go to find him, they can't find him, and he's somewhere on the battlefield or probably at Fredericksburg. Next. This is probably the most well-known artillery, light artillery actual company, and this would have been Company A of Loomis, and their gun is on display in Coldwater, Michigan. That's the actual gun. There were 6 guns. All but a couple, maybe one extra, were melted down during the war. That's on display in downtown Coldwater. It's gun number 26. Next, they were in the Western Theater. This is Jeb Stuart, and this is the man who shot and killed him. John Huff from Armada. He was in Michigan Cavalry Brigade, the 5th Regiment. He's the one that pulled the trigger that killed Jeb Stuart. Next. Here's Custer receiving the surrender towel. The actual surrender flag was a towel. And what occurred was Lee was trying to get to supplies when the Confederate Army left Petersburg. That's what they were trying to do when they were going west. They had trains at Appomattox Station with supplies. Custer got there first. At this time, he's commanding the 3rd Division. They get there, capture the supplies, they have a battle, and he ends up getting everything that Lee is going and trying to get for his army. As a result of Custer and the 3rd Division capturing those supplies, Lee will end up surrendering. The next day, there actually is a scene where the Army of the Potomac, the Army of Northern Virginia are lined up, and if you can imagine all those men, for a long ways, and a surrender flag will suddenly come out. It's a towel, it goes to Custer. There were other surrender flags, but the first one went to Custer. Next. This is in the Monroe County Museum. This is something Libby Custer put together. This is very unique. She put together a commemorative piece for officers under Custer. And what that piece included was a part of the flag. See how it's honeycombed? It's a towel. A part of the surrender table, which is the inside, and a part of Custer's red necktie. This belonged to Frederick Nims, who was on his staff. This is a replica of the table that the surrender terms were written on by Grant. And this is in the Monroe Museum, the actual one's in the Smithsonian. But this was given to Custer to give to his wife, Libby, with this note from Philip Sheridan. There is scarcely an individual in our service who had contributed more to bring about this desirable result than your very gallant husband. Next. This is Custer's brother, Tom, the first soldier in American history to be awarded 2 Medals of Honor. Next. This is the capture of Jefferson Davis. What happened is the commander, Benjamin Pritchard, who's part of Minty's brigade, we talked about Minty, who is over them, but he's not there. He sends Pritchard, and there's different cavalry regiments going south into Georgia trying to find them. They will be the one that hits the trail, and they will end up finding the actual encampment where Jefferson Davis is. They surround it, and it's overnight. They wait to daybreak, and then they end up springing the trap. And there are actually 5 guys that were on the spot. We just put a marker up, my Sons of Union Veterans, for one of them, this guy here. But what will happen is Jefferson Davis's wife will throw her coat and shawl over Davis as he tries to escape. That's where the rumor comes about that he's in a dress. And so the Northern press will hype that up, and you can see the pictures of him in a dress. During that time, a connection to Wisconsin, the 1st Wisconsin Cavalry was also there. There'll become a fight, and the 4th Michigan will actually fight the 1st Wisconsin, and tragically 2 of the Michigan men will be killed. Then they'll figure out that they're fighting each other and that will stop, and Davis will be captured. And both regiments, matter of fact, split the reward money. Next.
So is that the actual code?
It is, and this, yes, and this was, I took this picture in Biloxi, Mississippi at, believe it or not, the Jefferson Davis Presidential Museum. But I took that before Katrina, Hurricane Katrina, and I don't know if that exists today, which would be a tragedy. Now, that's something I don't know. Maybe someone can find out about that. But I think that was on the 1st floor, and everything on the 1st floor was wiped away. Next. This is the Sultana. You may have heard of that. The largest maritime disaster in American history. There's a debate between that and the Titanic. There's some new research that maybe the Titanic was larger than that, but still there were 2,200 men on that. Somewhere from 1,200 to 1,800 died. 280 of those deaths were Michigan men. Next. This is Admiral Farragut and the USS Hartford. Believe it or not, we believe there are more cannons off the USS Hartford on display in Michigan than anywhere in the country. There was a congressman in the northern part of the Mitten who got a hold of 8 of them. 3 of them are in Mackinac City. Next. This is Lincoln's chair. We were talking about that beforehand. This is in the Henry Ford Museum, and this is the chair that Lincoln was assassinated in. And I got asked, why is it in Michigan in the Henry Ford Museum? Well, the reason was Henry Ford had agents going around the country looking for different items that were Americana. He was putting together Greenfield Village in the museum. Believe it or not, the government had that for sale, and he bought it. Next. These are Henry Smith and Luther Baker. They were involved in the capture of John Wilkes Booth. Henry Smith was the guy who knocked on Mary Surratt's boarding house door. Mary Surratt answers, and Lewis Payne just happens to show up at the same time. He arrests both of them. He is from Monroe. He is buried in Monroe. This is Luther Baker. He was a Secret Service agent that was sent in charge of the 16th New York Cavalry trying to find John Wilkes Booth. If you know the story, the 16th come to the Garrett farm. That's where Booth is. Baker was ordered to capture him alive. And if you know the story, Boston Corbett got antsy and shot Booth through the neck. Booth will end up dying, and they didn't get him alive. But Baker's horse was named Buckskin, and Baker capitalized on this after the war. He gave all kinds of talks about it, sold postcards. This is a picture of Buckskin on the steps of the Capitol in Lansing. By the way, today that horse is stuffed and it's in the museum at Michigan State University. Next. Also involved in the Lincoln conspirators were the guys that were ordered to execute them and to imprison them. Christian Rath, who is here, and Richard Watts, who is here. He was from Adrian, he was from Jackson. His job was, he was the adjutant in charge of communications with the War Department, and Rath was the hangman. He built the gallows and tied the nooses. By the way, he thought Mary Surratt was innocent, never thought they would hang her. He has a memoir that came out like in Harper's Weekly. He had a gag order for 40 years where he lived into his 80s, did a newspaper article. It's fascinating. He talks about having a dream, and there's a knock on his bedroom door. He opens the door. It's the daughter of Mary Surratt, and she keeps saying to him, "Why did you kill my mother? Why did you kill my mother?" Next. These are the famous women, and this is Annie Etheridge, Sarah Edmonds, and Pauline Cushman. Annie Etheridge was known as Gentle Annie. She would be awarded the Kearney Cross right here. She was a woman who provided aid and encouragement. The soldiers loved her. She was very brave. They talk about her a lot. She is buried in Arlington. This next one is Sarah Emma Edmonds. She wrote a book called A Nurse and a Spy in the Union Army. She was a person who ended up playing a man in the Union Army. And she will end up getting sick, and she's afraid that the doctor's going to discover that she's a woman. She'll leave the Army, but she'll end up getting, years later, the soldiers will accept her, and they'll end up actually voting her to be the only woman in the GAR. This is Pauline Cushman. She was an actress, and Lincoln brevetted her a major. That's why she's in that uniform. But she's called the Spy of the Cumberland. And she has a fascinating story. She would spy on the Confederacy. She would do different programs as an actress, get information from Confederate commanders, but she got captured by Braxton Bragg, and 3 days before she was going to be hung, luckily the Union Army ended up freeing her, or she would have been hung and killed. Next. These are the most famous drummer boys. Johnny Clem, who is the drummer boy of the Chickamauga, and the next drummer boy, Robert Hendershot, who is the drummer boy of the Rappahannock. Believe it or not, Father Corby, the famous priest of the Irish Brigade, was born and reared in Detroit. Next. This is the most famous horse from Michigan, Renzi Winchester. You'll see it stuffed in the Smithsonian. That horse was bred in Michigan, given to Sheridan by the 2nd Michigan Cavalry because he commanded it at one time. This is the next famous horse, and this is Don Juan. This is Custer's horse that bolted in the Grand Review in Washington. That is buried in Tecumseh. These are famous Confederate connections, and we're almost done. Robert E. Lee set foot in Michigan. He helped end the Toledo War, if you know what that is. Okay? And how he did that was, he was a young engineer, and his job was to survey the new Michigan border that ended the Toledo War. And what was the result of the Toledo War?
We got the UP.
The UP went to Michigan, and I know you guys in Wisconsin think you should have it. And maybe so, it's connected to your state.
We did have it.
Yeah, but because of the Toledo War, you lost it. Okay? That's right. James Longstreet. James Longstreet owned land in Flint. His wife was the granddaughter of the founder of Flint. And his last daughter was born in Flint. He actually captured, and that family were split with Confederates and Union because the daughters married Confederate officers. But of course, when they married them, they were Union. They belonged to the U.S. Army. But that's his connection. He owned land in Flint. He actually captured his uncle by marriage, who was the commander of the 16th Michigan, and sent him to Libby Prison. This is John Pemberton. Pemberton, you know, commander at Vicksburg, actually a Pennsylvanian, but he actually, before the war, was stationed at Fort Mackinac. This is George Pickett. George Pickett's son married Lieutenant Henry Clay Christensen's daughter. He was a lieutenant in the 1st Michigan Infantry. They both were at Gettysburg, but he was fighting for the Union. The daughter who married Pickett's son has all kinds of connections with the Union Army. Her brother was a Medal of Honor awardee who served on Custer's staff. Her father was a United States Senator from Michigan who was a mentor of Custer. And he had another brother whose name was George Armstrong Custer Christensen. So interesting connection. What got me on this is in the Library of Congress, there's a file called the Pickett Christensen Papers. And I saw that and I go, well, that's interesting. I know both those names, and ends up they were all connected. Next. This is Andersonville. And as you know, 13,000 died at Andersonville. 735 of them were Michiganders. This guy right here, Riley Haynes, was in the 9th Michigan Cavalry. The same is probably the most famous diary or book about someone who was incarcerated in a prison. John Ransom's diary, probably the most famous diary there are about a prisoner of war. And then that diary, the introduction was by Bruce Canton, the most well-known writer of the Civil War. Bruce Canton was from Benzonia, Michigan. What connects them to this guy right here? He was in the 9th. But also, he was my 4th great uncle. And he was in the 9th, same as John Ransom. Next. Here's the last veterans of the war. This is Orlando LaValle. He was the last Michigan soldier. He died at 99 in 1948. He is buried in Fairgrove. This is a fascinating guy here. This is Joseph Clovis. He is the last United States Civil War African-American soldier. He died in Pontiac. Well, he actually died in the Dearborn Veterans Hospital, but he's buried in Pontiac. He didn't live in Michigan very long. Matter of fact, he moved there about when he was 100. He had a niece that lived in Pontiac, and so he ended up living with her. He was he was actually in a Louisiana regiment. He was in the 63rd United States Colored Infantry. He was born a slave in St. Bernard Parish, Louisiana. He escaped and ended up being in the Union Army. But he will be the last African American in the United States who fought in the Civil War, and at the time living in Michigan. That concludes the program. These are the photographic images that I used. And a lot of this information is in the book, Michigan Civil War Landmarks. And thank you very much for coming.
Personal question. What got you interested in the Civil War experience?